we have to enjoy now a nice program, and we will start with a very outstanding keynote. And this is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Julian Nida-Rümelin. So Julian, if you allow me to ask you with your first name. Julian is a German philosopher and public intellectual, okay, very well known. He served as a state minister for culture of the Federal Republic of Germany with Chancellor Schröder, so a very impressive position. He was professor of philosophy and political theory at LMU, so Ludwig Maximilian University of München until 2020. And Julian was also the vice chairman of the German Ethics Committee until last April. Okay, and indeed, it is interesting, just a short note, to notice that in Germany, as in France, it is not always obvious to get people renewed in their function right in time. So in particular, currently, there is only 4 or 5 members in the German Ethics Committee left. Okay, so a lot of nominations should be undergoing. We are in a similar situation in several similar committees in France, indeed. Okay, so Julian, thank you very much for coming here, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning, everybody in the room and online. I'm going to present you some ideas, or maybe to be more precise, the philosophical background of a conception that we name digital humanism. So this might sound strange, especially for a French person, because as we remember, well, the presentation, yeah. As we remember well, there after the Second World War, good part of the intellectual debate was against humanism. So not only Heidegger, but also Sartre and many others. Conflict between Camus and Sartre. Now, this is a contribution to renew humanism in a way. So this has a broader perspective. And maybe I add some personal remarks to understand a little the motivations. So that's perfect. I think it's perfect. I studied originally physics and mathematics, as some here, but then I was seduced to change to philosophy by the quite well-known philosopher Wolfgang Stegmüller, who offered a doctoral thesis under his supervision about the philosophy of physics, or a special topic of philosophy of physics. And then I began working there and found out that this is a very interesting area of research, but it's also very much limited to those few physicists who are interested in philosophical questions, and those even more seldom philosophers who understand physics. So I asked him, what do we do? I want to change the subject. And as all great thinkers, was very generous and said, well, what can we do with your skills, your ability with formal things and mathematics and so on and so forth? And I proposed to him to use game theory and decision theory in order to analyze moral problems. So this was the start of the academic career in philosophy. So this is the background. Wolfgang Stegmüller and the whole institute, where I worked also as assistant professor, was explicitly analytic. So in opposition to mainstream philosophy in Germany these days, in opposition to understand philosophy as a book science, as something that is about the past, as something that is about the big philosophers from Plato till Derrida. Yeah? So you have to use analytic tools to analyze things in philosophy. And this goes along, and now we come to the topic of my talk, goes along with certain, shall I name it, ideological presuppositions that are seldomly made explicit. One of these presuppositions is naturalism. What is naturalism? Well, I understand naturalist positions as telling, well, everything that is in the world, in the last research, can be analyzed by the means of natural sciences, or to be more radical, by physics. Yeah. So there is a problem because it's so complex that the means of physics do not suffice to explain all these phenomena, but in principle it should be possible. In principle, though it's also a reductionist position. Yeah. We should aim at reducing the whole spectrum of the sciences to the natural sciences and then to physics, so to say. So, yeah. Well, this is a very ambitious project, and it's given up. In the meantime, nobody seriously thinks that this could be realized, but the ideology remains. Yeah. And, well, I felt there's something wrong with it. Yeah. For example, ethics. However, should it be possible to reduce or to analyze ethical problems in the conceptual frame of the natural sciences? Well, there is one offer. This is sociobiology. So this is an empirical discipline that explains what genetic predispositions we have in our behavior. But this is not normative ethics. That's something wrong. That's something different. Or to take a poem, how to analyze a poem with the means of the natural sciences. That's a strange undertaking. History. Well, if we understand something in historical terms, we understand the intentions people involved had and to which consequences this led, and so on and so forth. And this was a starting point of rethinking my general philosophical attitude. So I'm still an analytic philosopher, was president of the Society of Analytic Philosophy in Germany to strengthen this camp. But I'm also a humanist. So this is humanism. And I tried to give a more systematic account of humanism. This is not the topic of the talk today, but this is the background. In 2016, Surkamp in German, I'm sorry to say that it's not translated into English, humanistische Reflexionen. You can read German, can read there the more broad philosophical background. And since then, roughly 2014, 15, 16, I used also the term of digital humanism. So I coined this term, so to say. I think I was the first one, but I didn't Google the problem till now, with a quite specific content. So it's a quite specific content. And this is relevant to what I'm going to present you now, because strangely enough, we both, because we wrote a book together, Nathalie Weidenfeld, who is a cultural scientist, also film theorist. We are married also, but this is irrelevant here. And we wrote a book together, published in 2018 in German, and then later on Springer in an English version, open access. I leave 2 copies of it here for the library. And this book was, well, got a prize in Austria, the Bruno Kreisky Prize for the best political book. It's not a scientific publication in the narrower sense. It's directed at a broader audience or broader, And then in Austria, especially in Vienna, there began a movement, so to say. You find it under the heading of Manifesto Digital Humanism. Manifesto Digital Humanism in the informatics of the Technical University of Vienna. Hannes Wertner, professor there, my age, is a cooperating partner in this project of digital humanism. And then later on, the city of Vienna took this attitude or account, digital humanism, as a general account how to cooperate between politics, economy, civil society, and so on, interested public in all these projects that they have. In the meantime, Vienna got also a prize as the most advanced smart city in Europe or something like that. So this is under this heading of digital humanism. And if you look to the publications, I give a hint afterwards, so secondary publications about digital humanism, you get the impression that it's beautiful that so many persons think that this is an attractive concept or conception, but on the other side, the content is changing. So some say, for example, or write, this is an account for re-enchanting the world. But this is wrong, as we will see. Yeah. So, what is digital humanism? As hinted already at, digital humanism is a version of humanism in general, systematic account of humanism. What is the core concept of humanism? I take as the core concept human authorship. So we are authors of our lives, so to say, in a way. We are dependent on social surroundings, on upbringings, genetic dispositions, and so on and so forth. But there must be a certain space which is broad enough that we view ourselves as being authors of what we are doing or what we are saying. And if somebody asks us, we can give answers. Why did you do it? Why did you say it? So it has something to do with intentions. And now, why is humanism so important? Because it is the normative and the philosophical and the anthropological basis of the human rights tradition. No human universal rights without humanism. This is the background and the usual interpretation of it, maybe not in all cultural regions in the world, but in general, in the majority of the interpretation, this is the background. And democracy is closely linked to the human rights tradition and the normativity of human rights. So without humanism, no democracy, to put it in one sentence. Now, digital humanism is about human authorship in times of digital transformation. And its normative implications in economy, technology, polity, and culture concern the conditions of human authorship in times of artificial intelligence. So the idea is, and we have one, Mr. Kirchner and me have one experience in common. This is being member of a national ethics committee or ethics council, as the German national committee is named. This is an interesting experience. We had 24 members in this ethics council. It was in the midst of the corona pandemic. So quite stressful because it was politically quite important how we see the things. And strangely enough, I was one of two philosophers there. 24 persons, two philosophers. And 10 years ago or something, even more, I was president of the German Society for Philosophy, General Society for Philosophy, and there was no person, no, not even one from philosophy. And then we thought that this had to be changed, and then we had one, and in the meantime there are two. I say this because an ethics commission without ethics is somehow problematic. Theology is quite strong. Medicine is strong. It's good that we have so much from some sociologists and so on and so forth. But it is not primarily an ethics commission in the sense counseling with the background of ethics. It's the ethics commission with ethics in a quite narrow sense, so very practically oriented. Nevertheless, we then decided to write a statement, a position statement, as it is called in the translation, I think, Positionspapier, that has more than 400 pages in the printed version. You find it online on the homepage of Deutscher Ethikrat, or German Ethics Council, but not in English, in German, and the short version also in English. The short version doesn't give the main ideas. It's a really short version. It's an executive summary, so to say. But if you can read German, and I think soon we will have an English translation of it, of the long version, you will see that there's lots of philosophy in. And it was mostly a cooperation between two members of this ethics council. One is Judith Simon, who is a psychologist and ethicist of digital transformation in Hamburg, and me. And we discussed these more philosophical aspects of how to deal with the digital technologies in different areas, medicine, for example, education, for example, also public communication, and public administration. These are the four fields in which we were a little bit more concrete. Under this background, I would say, of digital humanism, even if you find rarely this term in the long version of the paper. It's about authorship, how to strengthen authorship in times of digital transformation, how to strengthen authorship, not weaken authorship, and not substituting authorship on a broad range. I give an example. So if we use digital tools in education, for some time it was said that, for example, Hungary or Germany and others are far behind the development in Finland or Denmark and other countries, Singapore and so on and so forth. I don't know whether you realized it. The Minister President of Denmark apologized for, and the Minister for Education apologized in front of the pupils and students that they used so extensively digital tools in education, because the result was that Denmark lost its range or rating in the international studies and others. We have a similar result in this Facebook project of 2 years in the United States. In Singapore, they advised schools that they sent their students outside classroom because so many got problems, how do you call it, short-sightedness, as a result that they too many hours a day used displays, and so on and so forth. So, and we had a heated debate about the question, is digital education something that aims at substituting teachers or strengthening the relation between pupils and teachers using digital tools? That's a wholly different paradigm of using digital tools that are partly very, very good and very helpful, I think. But the perspective, likewise in analogy to automatic driving, someday we don't need the driver. Someday we don't need the teacher. Is the wrong attitude. And if you look to the scientific results, there's this big meta-study by Hetty, the Australian scientist who analyzed many studies. This is thousands of studies, and this is a meta-study. And the main result was it's almost irrelevant how big the classes are, how the school system is organized. The most important point is the relation between pupils and teachers. If you look to the relevant causal factors of success in the educational process. So to give this example. Now, sometimes it's easier to make a certain account clear if you say what it is not or what it is opposed to. And so I quote two oppositions. One main opponent is that what we call animism. That is the current animistic re-enchantment of the world via digital agents. But there is another opponent, so to say, which strangely enough is closely related to the first, although philosophically it seems that these are two very different interpretations of digital transformation. And this is the mechanistic reduction of humans as a kind of digital machines, or as Harari called it in his Homo Deus, well, this is not very well working software system, and someday it will be substituted. Now, if you look back to the history of technological development, there is one interesting phenomenon, and this is that almost every phase of strong innovation was accompanied by a kind of ideological over-interpretation of these changes. This is true for the electricity innovation and for many others. And typically, this over-interpretation or this ideological, how do you say in English, Überhöhung, results in, well, it's in the meantime, it's politically not correct anymore, but I say it nevertheless, in a hysterical attitude. On the one hand, an euphoria that everything becomes perfect now, and we get a wonderful world, and everything will be resolved by these technologies. And on the other hand, the fear that this is close to doomsday. Yeah. And this phenomenon we can observe in almost every newspaper article about digital transformation. I give some examples of the doomers, so to say. Yeah. So it's all very, very dangerous, and we will lose control. And what will happen if these digital agents take over power globally? Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, Gary Marcus recently, also Sam Altman, that's interesting, and many others. And on the other hand, you have this salutary hopes. So I'm going not into the, I'm not an expert in that, so you should invite Natalie Weidenfeld for this. But it has something to do with the Christian background of our Western culture, obviously. That is not typical for the Chinese debate, not for Japanese debate, not for the Indian debate. It's typical for the Western, and especially US debate. And this is a very old phenomenon. You take the Bible, and there you have these two options, hell or salvation. And then you interpret everything as, well, you have two options, hell or salvation. Neither nor, I would say, no salvation, no hell should be expected. Then a more aesthetic aspect. Look to Apple stores. They are like Protestant churches, and this is no chance. This is, so even the apple is something like Jesus coming from the sky, and so. I don't know whether this is conscious, yeah, it's a consciously chosen aesthetic form, but it's so obvious. Yeah. Now to the more philosophical dimension. What I'm working on as a philosopher is the role of reasons. Who is interested in that? Palgrave Macmillan, 2023, published my book on theory of practical reason. There everything is in about the role of reasons. And reason is a basic concept for me, cannot be defined by other concepts. It's a basic concept. It's a normative concept. Reason is something objective, not subjective. It's not a psychological phenomenon. And reason, we are affected by reasons, so it has a normative relevance. And if you take this as the basic concept of analyzing a humanistic interpretation of the human condition, so to say, then you will find that, for example, but these are three very important dimensions: practical reason, freedom as we understand it, freedom of choice, and responsibility are only three aspects of the same phenomenon. And the phenomenon is being affected by reasons. So reason is objective, concept is understood objectively, but being affected by is a psychological phenomenon. And this is not something mystical. If you have a good proof in mathematics for a theorem, you usually believe in that theorem. So understanding this is a good proof leads to a certain mental act. I accept that theory. Usually. There are some exceptions, but then we are faced with some kind of irrationality. Now, my account of practical philosophy is coherentist, also pragmatist, in the sense there is not one basis from which everything can be deduced, like modern utilitarianism assumes in ethics and others. But you have to go back and forth and look whether things are coherent or not coherent. If they're not coherent, you have to change something, and it depends what you take to be more central or less central for your epistemic system in which you move, so to say. Agency is a representation of reasons. If we understand each other as reasonable agents, reasons in English, it's also terminologically close. In German, it's not. So in this respect, the English language is useful for the philosophical analysis. And so if somebody behaves in a certain sense, and we take him to be a responsible person, then we take this behavior as a representation of two kinds of propositional attitudes, preferences and epistemic states, so convictions, opinions, whatever, beliefs. And these beliefs, so these two kinds of propositional attitudes, preferences and beliefs, are based on, if we take this person as a reasonable person, are based on reasons. Because he can give, or she can give, answers if asked. Why? So you have, again, this basic role of reasons. This is not rationalism. I skipped that maybe, but if you are interested in, I can explain why it is not a rationalist interpretation of humans. And this has some implications for AI philosophy. And let me explain a little by referring to a very old debate. Well, in 1950, the beautiful and interesting article by Alan Turing was published in Mind. Mind is a philosophical journal, and where he so-called Turing test is based on this article in mine, 1950. And what is seldomly made explicit is that this, what Turing tentatively, he's not apodictic, he's quite tentatively arguing that we should not discriminate between, I use the modern term, with a bot that is communicating in a certain way like humans do, and a human regarding the mental states. So this is the option of that what is sometimes called strong AI. So we ascribe, this is also very dangerous terminology, but it's used widely also in analytic philosophy. We ascribe certain attitudes, we ascribe certain mental states, given certain behavior, utterances included. We ascribe certain mental states if a bot behaves like a human being. And this is bound very closely to a kind of Wittgensteinian logical behaviorism. I'm personally convinced, and I worked with that area for a lot, for many years, this is not really Wittgenstein. It's Wittgensteinian logical behaviorism. Yeah. It's not the view Wittgenstein himself had, but it's not important whether this is so or is not so. And in these years, 1950, this late Wittgenstein behaviorism spread in the English-speaking world, especially in Great Britain, and Turing was obviously very much influenced by it. So Gödel was the opponent to that. And there's this much earlier, 20 years earlier, article, so published in German, im Monatshefte für Mathematik und Physik über formal unentscheidbare Sätze der Principia Mathematica, Russell Whitehead, und verwandter Systeme. If you look to the vast secondary literature about these Gödel theorems, I find the most beautiful one, this strange intellectual, R.M. Smulyan. He's also written a wonderful book about first-order logic that I advise to read, my students, I advise to read this book if they begin with logics, the Gödel incompleteness theorems, 1992, and then a very audacious interpretation of this result by the physicist and mathematician, also Nobel Prize winner, Roger Penrose. He connects this phenomenon, so let's call the Gödel phenomenon, with consciousness. I'm agnostic about whether he's right, but it's a very interesting interpretation. And this leads to that what I might call the critique of strong AI. This is a vast philosophical debate. One of the highlights is this Chinese chamber argument, John Searle in the 1980s, and the debate about that. Maybe we should not go into the details of all this discussion here, but what is left out is a second argument that also John Searle originally published, and this is an argument about realism. So if you are I'm a realist, realist in the following sense, the world is in a certain state. We don't know this state because we lack the means to describe and explain everything. But the world is in, let's leave out quantum mechanics for the moment. So the world is, let's say the life world, the world which is accessible by the usual means, not microphysics, and not cosmology. The medium-ranged world, so medium-sized world. And we don't describe the state of the world, but we have only certain aspects, but there's only one state of the world. And now this argument is very simple and straightforward. It goes like that. Now, if we describe a computer, as John Searle calls it, we describe a computer, it's enough to have physical and technical concepts. And we describe it totally. There is no rest that is undescribed. So what's going on is if the computer utters sentences, the bot, yeah, or if it makes calculations, well, it's us. So we interpret certain physical states of the software system that governs these states as true, wrong, 1, 0. Yeah? The Boolean algebra is here important because it has isomorphic structure between these two interpretations. But there are infinitely many other interpretations. Most of them probably would result in mere chaos or not understandable usage of these physical, technical processes and states. It's us, not the world. It's us. Yeah. So, and the other is about weak AI. Well, weak AI can be defined as the thesis. Strong AI is a thesis, and weak AI is a thesis. It's not a concept, but the thesis. Weak AI, in the philosophical discussion, says it is in principle possible to simulate every kind of human behavior, human utterances, human judgment, and so on and so forth, using software systems. And here Gödel comes into play, or it's relevant. So if you, some of you might have taught logics at the university, and the second year in logics, I taught it in the University of Göttingen, is about a little bit more ambitious knowledge, for example, to prove certain theorems of first order or second order predicate logic. And then the students who attended your course last year said, well, can you give us a mechanical form how to prove? And then I have to say, no. We know that there isn't one. There is none. There is none. Yeah? From predicate logic, first order predicate logic, onwards to more complex logical systems. There is none. And we know that there is one because Gödel proved that. So how shall I prove then? Yeah, well, try. And the strange thing is, 2/3 have success. Yeah? And not after 100,024 trials. Yeah? The more intuitively good students, 1 trial, and they get it. And some 2 or 3, and they get it. I give them rules, yeah? Axiomatic system and other system, Gensen-Kalkül and many others, but they can do it. I had a fight with Manfred Breu, you might know him from Technical University of Munich, and he said, well, we have these wonderful software system that can prove also theorems of first order, of second order, third order, predicate logic, and so on, deontic logic, and so on and so forth. That's true. But what's going on there? Well, lots of trials. Oh, yeah, and the halting problem is solved usually by many, many, many trials, and then you get one result. And this is something different than the students do. And there's an interesting correspondence between Gödel and Turing, where Turing interestingly answers to Gödel and says, well, probably without intuition, no mathematics. Yeah, it's not like Turing, the mechanist, and Gödel, somehow mystical person. Okay. Now maybe you have questions I can answer in the discussion, and I come to some fields of ethical implications. I presented one field, this is digital education. Digital communication. So if you take this central account that is about strengthening human authorship, And you have these empirical results. There is this Bavarian Institute of Digital Transformation. I'm part of the directory board there, and there are lots of more sociological studies going on, so projects. And there are really many very interesting results. I'm not a sociologist, but I learn a lot from these. And if you see that there are certain structures of communication established by the rules that govern, for example, WhatsApp. It's strange how many students are kind of addicted to using WhatsApp. How can this be? Yeah? And the reason can be analyzed, and it can be. I should be short. You look. No, okay. And it can analyze why this is the case, and then you get exactly this situation. How much is still authorship? So the 11-year-old pupil knows what he is doing. He uses these tools in order to realize some interest he or she has, and so on and so forth. And what is somehow conditioning the behavior of these 11, 12, 14-year-old kids. And if you get to the result, it's like an addiction, then we should change the usage. But how to change it? Yeah? It's not easy to answer. And then you have the question of the juridical dimension, what is legitimate, where can you intervene, where should the state establish certain alternative infrastructures of communication and interaction, digital infrastructures of communication and interaction that are not primarily used for commercial aims of private firms, for example. This is a topic that we discussed also in the National Ethics Council, digital infrastructure. Now, I'm not against using the language we use for human agents. Yeah? You get an advice. You cooperate with digital tools or AI. Yeah? I'm not against not even against using the term artificial intelligence, although I would say, write it always with capital A. Why? Because there is no artificial intelligence. There is no. But you can use the term if you know there is no. Yeah. So something like that. So if we take this as metaphorical, that's okay. If you don't take it as metaphorical, if we take it seriously, then we fall back into an animistic interpretation of the world. Yeah? And this is also a loss of rationality. And I take it to be quite dangerous. And this has some quite concrete implications. I give two of them. One is a project that we now realize, I think it's 3 or 4 years, ethical deliberation for agile software processes. If the things are so complex, if you cannot just take one simple algorithm optimizing some value function as utilitarians would like it, yeah? For example, in automatic driving. If deliberation results often in kinds of dilemmas, ethical dilemmas that cannot be resolved. I'm convinced that this is the case. If you have a deontological interpretation of ethical norms, I think you cannot avoid dilemmas. Kant had the opposite idea. Yeah? He thought there are no dilemmas if you take, but this is obviously wrong. Even if you use the Kantian categorical imperative, this is obviously wrong. But yeah, it's a complicated question. So if you think that ethical deliberation cannot be substituted by one principles from which you deduce, given empirical descriptions of the situation of decision, what has to be done. In many cases, you cannot do that. Then deliberation is up to the agents, not up to philosophy, not up to informatics and whatever. And now who is deliberating? And now our proposal is all participating, all those who participate should be able to take part in this deliberative processes. And there's not the coder who is just coding and others tell him, do this. Yeah? But he himself or she herself can deliberate about the aspects and discuss it in teams, whatever, and say, well, I think we should think about this or that. That could become a dangerous scenario, and so on and so forth. But in the usual study of informatics, this plays no role. And I have the experience also in cooperation with Alexander Pretschner from Informatics of Technical University, and the director of this institute I named before, Bavarian Research Institute on for Digital Transformation. There is lots of a fervent interest in the students of mathematics, informatics, physics. They want to discuss these topics. And then you are the experts. You can tell whether this is right and wrong. But my impression is that large language models also make the coding less important because it is done more and more, not by those coders, but by software systems. And so the aspect of what do we want, how do we design it, with whom do we cooperate, and so on and so forth, becomes more and more important also for the profession, yeah, of those who studied informatics. But I'm not from informatics, so you are the expert. You can judge that much better. Or to give another example, this is about robotics. There was an EU project, RoboLaw. It's completed years ago. But it's still quite relevant. We looked at using robotics, for example, in houses for the old aged in Japan, where you don't have persons from abroad who work for low salaries because they do not want any immigration in Japan, but they have an old aged society. And so economically, it makes sense to use quite expensive robots in the care work there. And we ask those that were living in such a situation, and it's quite interesting that this was quite ambivalent. On the one hand, they said, well, I find it also has a certain cultural bias or dependency. I find it good that there's no person who touches me, who does this or that with me personally, because it's shameful also. Yeah? Some everyday help in certain societies are experienced as being a shameful situation for a person that is not able to look for herself anymore. But on the other hand, I feel uncomfortable because there is always somebody in the room. So there is nobody, but the impression that there is somebody in the room gives them a sentiment. Well, in German you would say unheimlich. Unheimlich. How to translate it? Uncanny. Okay. So, and I discussed with Haddadin. Haddadin is an expert in robotics. He has a firm and also professor at TU University, quite famous in Germany. And we both have the same opinion. We should give up this anthropomorphic trend in robotics. The robots should be used for certain tools, they are tools for certain goals, and that's it. They should not imitate humans as much as it is possible in order to come out of this impression, the sentiments, for example, of being uncanny. So I used more than the minutes you attributed to me, so you can read it as the final plea for digital humanism if you like, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.